unless you would like to.
Nope, I'm just along for the ride. I'm good. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Feel free to chime in whenever you like.
You might have seen a box that popped up on your screen that just says that we're going live on social media. So you can hit got it. That's the blue button. And we can say hi to everyone who's watching on Facebook and YouTube. Hello, everyone.
Hi, Facebook. Hi, YouTube. This is Veterans Breakfast Club for Monday, November 8th. We have an really incredible group of guests here tonight. We are welcoming Canadian World War II veterans, Ken Lett, Jack Reid, Don White, and Jim Parks, between the ages of 96 and 98 years old, if you can believe it, each having very, very different experiences through World War II. And to help present and lead this conversation will be Scott Masters from Crestwood Preparatory College. It's going to be an exciting program filled with, I think, some very interesting stories. And we're happy that you're all here with us.
Happy to be here. Happy to be with you.
Thanks, Don. We'll be letting in our audience here shortly too. And you may notice if you've joined us before on either Facebook or YouTube that Todd DiPastino is usually the host for Monday night. He's the executive director of VBC. He is currently at the Steeler game. They will be doing a halftime honoring of veterans organizations.
Yeah. It's during a home game before Veterans Day. The Steelers like to honor veterans because of Veterans Day. So I think they'll be honoring veterans and then also veterans organizations local to the area. So yeah, looking forward to that. Yeah,
VBC's a part of that. Super excited for that. We got some great announcements here at the top of the program whenever we come on that I'm going to leave you all with the bated breath to hear about. Some exciting developments on our Vetathon, which will be coming up Thursday. What's a Vetathon? Hang out to find out. And we also have a Scuttlebutt podcast that was released today that I'll chat about for a bit before we get to our main guests. And we look like we're going to have a fairly good-sized audience tonight, so that's exciting.
Yeah, just about a minute here. I will start the theme music and then let people in, and then we can get started.
Ellie, did you notice that I bought a new red, white, and blue shirt for a VBC night?
Is that a new one?
I've been wearing the same red, white, and blue shirt for about 3 years.
That is great. Great addition to the wardrobe.
Yep. If I have two shirts.
When do you get to watch it?
Say that, Jeffrey?
Listen, before I forget, on Vision TV tonight at 10 p.m. That's a Zoom channel. Libby Zamer, General Romer, and I myself are discussing Remembrance Day. That's at 10 o'clock tonight on Vision TV.
Thank you for that, Jeffrey. And that's great because that'll be after our program ends, so you can tune straight to them after you're with us.
Yeah.
That's Jim. If you want to rename him there,
Jim
Parks.
I will do that. Thank you.
Yeah, it's already been recorded. We were about a week ago. They taped the interview.
And Jim, how is General Romer these days?
He's pretty good. We talked a lot, and we passed along information back and forth. And I asked him, I said, what kind of a plane were you flying when you shot up Rommel? He says a Thunderbolt or something like that. So he was flying in a sortie, more than one plane, 2, 3 planes. So we talked out a bit. It'll show up on the program anyway, our little discussion. Yeah.
Very good. I've never had the opportunity to meet him, but that's an incredibly famous story.
Well, he's a nice fellow. Very nice guy. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm going to start the theme music and we can start letting people in.
Welcome everyone to, I was going to say the Scuttlebutt, if you know anything about VBC, because that's normally the show that I'm hosting. As you can tell, Todd DiBastino is not here tonight. Todd is at the Steeler game representing the VBC, who will be one of the organizations honored during their Veterans Halftime program. But he sends his best and misses being here. Otherwise, my name is Sean Hall. For those of you who I have not had the pleasure of meeting, I'm the Director of Programming with the Veterans Breakfast Club. And this is VBC Happy Hour for Monday, November 8th. We have an incredible program lined up for you this evening, which will be led by the incredible Scott Masters. We have Canadian World War II veterans Ken Lett, Jack Reid, Don White, and Jim Parks joining us to talk about their stories, as well as Claire Baum, who was liberated. She'll be talking near the end of the program, so make sure you stick around for that. Joining me, as always, is Ellie DiBastino. Ellie, do you ever take a day off?
Never, although I might be taking a day off after Vetathon.
The Vetathon. So if you have not heard about this, this is something that VBC is super excited about. We've been buzzing about it for a couple of weeks, but if you haven't heard about it, this Thursday, we decided that we are going to hold a 24-hour veterans program on Zoom, midnight to midnight, all day Thursday, veteran stories, veteran organizations. Every hour is going to have a different host, a different theme. You can chime in and come on to Zoom at any point throughout the entire day, 2 a.m., 5 a.m., noon, 3 p.m., at any point. And we're going to be here talking with veterans and hearing about their stories. You can find everything on our website, veteransbreakfastclub.org. Ellie's going to throw that link up here in the chat, and make sure you check it out because it's a great website. She did such a beautiful job on this, by the way. Our whole schedule is built right there. You'll get to see, hey, we're talking with World War II veterans at 7 p.m. And in fact, I'd actually like to bring Glenn into this conversation because, Glenn, we have a coup here of just getting an incredible guest on for your program, which is going to be from 7 to roughly 9 p.m. on Veterans Day. Who do we have coming up?
Right. Actually, I think we have three great, interesting veterans. The first hour, 7 to 8, there are going to be two combat fighter pilots. One we spoke with earlier this year and went through not only his World War II experience, but his Korean War experience, and then his Vietnam experience and his Cold War experience as Joe Peterburs, who was a P-51 pilot in World War II. And then the other is a man named Jay Stout, who we've not talked to before. But Jay was a Marine fighter pilot in Desert Storm, 37 combat missions. And what's interesting is that he has gone on, he's a retired lieutenant colonel. He's gone on to write 4 or 5 books about World War II 8th Air Force history, including about fighter pilots in World War II. So it's kind of fighter pilot hour. And then the second hour is something that I'm just incredibly excited about because one of my favorite books, perhaps my favorite book about World War II, is called With the Old Breed by...
Some of you may have heard of that.
Yeah, I think it's considered and is one of the best war memoirs ever written by Eugene Sledge. We have his son, Henry Sledge, on. Henry has a lot of... memorabilia. He has a lot to say about his father. And I think it'd be a really fascinating 45 minutes, 60 minutes with Henry Sledge, son of Sledgehammer, who was featured in the Pacific miniseries.
So that'll be at 8 p.m. And don't sleep on the rest of, because we're going to be sleeping, I tell you, don't sleep on the rest of that day because we do have incredible guests lined up throughout the whole 24 hours. It's going to be a lot of fun. Ellie, you're even hosting a couple hours. Am I right?
I am. Yes, I will be making an MRE live on camera, or at least trying to. So we'll see how that goes. At 2 a.m. What better time for an MRE than 2 a.m.?
Brad Washabaugh, what was the craziest time you ever ate an MRE?
I'm trying to remember. Anytime you could eat in peace without, at least seeing what you're eating was a gift, I think.
I think, Ellie, you have to turn off all the lights and do the MRE in the dark.
Yes.
So we'll make it even more interesting. And also, if you did not get a chance to see the Scuttlebutt this week, that released today. We had so much fun talking with the North Allegheny JROTC program that we went a little south of Pittsburgh and went to Pine Richland and talked with their JROTC program, a couple of their cadets and their commander, Michael Gasparetto. Had a fantastic conversation with them. If the young people that are here on the program, if you'd like to pop over to veteransbreakfastclub.org, Ellie will throw that in the chat as well for the Scuttlebutt. You can see sort of what JRTC is, how these cadets are enjoying it, what they're doing to set themselves up for future success. Great conversation. We only have one more episode coming up for season 4, and that'll be released next Monday. And without further ado, I think that's all the announcements. Ellie, is that right?
I believe so, yeah.
Great. For those Steeler fans that are here, forget about the game. We'll probably win against Chicago anyway. So just enjoy the program tonight. I want to introduce here Scott Masters. Scott is a teacher as well as the head of the Oral History Project at Crestwood Preparatory College. Scott, it's a pleasure. You've been a part of VBC for a while, and you bring some incredible guests with you tonight. And just wanted to say hello and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. This is a real honor. I think discovering VBC last year was definitely one of the more positive moments of the pandemic for me. So I think it's been about a year now that I've been joining you guys.
That's great. And are you a veteran yourself?
No, I'm not, but I have a lot of veterans in my family, and that's a big part of the reason I got very interested in military history.
And can you tell us about Crestwood? I know their mission, and I'm going to quote the website here so people kind of understand what the school is to provide a secure, customized, total learning environment and community that helps each Crestwood student optimize their current and future academic and personal success as confident, accomplished, well-rounded individuals who can take their place successfully in the world. It sounds like a really interesting and exciting place to be.
It is. I've been there actually for 20 years now. I've been a high school teacher for 30 years, and it's a wonderful place. There's about 500 or so students, and there's actually one current student with us tonight and one graduate who are going to share a couple of memories, not about their education at Crestwood, but more so about their role in the Oral History Project. But I noticed that they were both smiling there when you read that blurb off the website.
It's good. Yeah, and this Oral History Project sounds so wonderful. VBC recently started our own oral history project. We just got it off the ground a couple of weeks back. So we're excited to sort of live up to the bar that you guys have set. I've checked out the website. It's several of our current guests are on there, and we'll throw the link up for those as well. But I figured I'd hand it off to you, Scott, and you can sort of take us through.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that. So I did want to say what an honor it is to be asked to do this. And I did notice Jack Watson on screen, and just sort of looking through, I see so many familiar faces, but my students last year had the opportunity to do an interview with Jack, who's of course an American veteran of the Pacific War. And Jack mentioned during the course of his interview that he felt bad that he knew very little about Canada's role in the Second World War. And, I mentioned to Todd that maybe this would be a nice idea for a show, and he agreed, and here we are. And November is the perfect week to do it because, of course, it's Remembrance Day for Canadians on Thursday, Veterans Day in the United States. So this is an ideal time, and I'm so happy that I was able to convince 4 vets to come along with me.
That's great. And can you tell us a bit of history of what Remembrance Day is in Canada?
Yeah, well, Remembrance Day, November the 11th, 1918. I almost feel like I should ask one of the students to explain it, but I'm not going to put them that much on the spot. That was, of course, the declaration of the armistice in the First World War. And for everywhere within the British Empire, the British Commonwealth, it's a day that's celebrated and commemorated by the many countries that were involved in that conflict. And for Canada, this is really one of the crucial holidays of the year. It's something at school that we treat with reverence and solemnity. And typically we would have an assembly where members of the community would come in. We haven't been able to do that for the last couple of years, but it's still, really a hallmark on the school calendar and something we all feel very strongly about. And that's the reason why so many of us are wearing poppies tonight. It's something that people typically wear as a reminder of the poem In Flanders Field.
That's great. And can you also, I had a question that's sort of maybe a dumb question, but I'm a civilian as well. I'm not a veteran. And though I don't know much about the Canadian military, I'm wondering what the differences are between the American military and the Canadian military. Are they very similar?
That's a tough question for me to answer as a non-vet. I almost feel like I should defer to the men who are joining us here tonight. But in terms of looking at the Second World War, which is obviously our focus tonight, Canada had Army, Navy, and Air Force. As you're going to see, I'm a teacher, so I of course put together a PowerPoint presentation for this. Canada's military preparedness at the start of the war was almost nil. Canada really was very unprepared, but very quickly an industrial boom happened, the economy was adjusted, and Canada grew into that role. Now, Canada is obviously a much smaller country than the United States. So the big difference you're certainly going to notice is that Canada's war effort was almost entirely oriented towards the Atlantic and Europe. Okay, really, Canada was not involved in the Pacific War to any degree outside of a few spots.
I think, though, this is Glenn. I just introduced this point about the Canadian participation in World War II, which I always found so fascinating, so inspiring. And that's that 100% of the Canadian World War II veterans are volunteers. There was no draft in Canada for World War II. And it just underlies the debt we owe to those veterans of World War II from Canada.
And the four men who are joining us tonight are all volunteers. As you're going to hear them talk about in a little bit, they were so anxious to volunteer that they were trying to do it when they were teenagers. And I know that Jim got in when he was underage, but Ken, Jack, and Don were very young as well. And I've got lots of great photos of them that I'll share as I go along. But I do have this presentation set, so I'll go into share screen, Sean, if that is okay, and
Please.
bring that up on your screen. And as you guys can see, again, as a high school teacher, this is kind of how we go through every single day. But I thought I would, talk a little bit about where the idea for this project came from. And a lot of it really goes to the fact that both of my grandfathers were veterans. The man in the middle here, George Masters, is my paternal grandfather. You can obviously tell that he was in the Canadian Navy during the Second World War. My mother's father, George Kerrigan, was a veteran of the First World War. And this is a picture of him and four of his brothers, all of whom went overseas in World War I. My grandfather Kerrigan lived to be 105 years old. So I got to grow up with him and hear all of his stories as a teenager and even as a young man in my 20s. And I remember vividly when I was about 14 years old or so, doing an interview with him on an old audio cassette. And one of my great regrets in life is that audio cassette went missing somewhere along the line. I really wish I had that. But I effectively did my own oral history project in high school. And when I became a high school history teacher, I thought that this would be something to get my own students to do. And I think it's been absolutely fantastic. So we have built this website, and I'll give you guys a really, really quick look at the page and how it works. But if you go to the landing page, you'll see a number of subpages. And if you click on military veterans, for example, there is a drop-down menu, which literally has hundreds of names. There's something like 400 names on there now. And if you click on one of them, I'll click on this one here because his name is very auspicious. We interviewed a Canadian veteran about a year ago by the name of Harry Eisenhower, no relation to the other Eisenhower. But when I asked him about it, Harry said that he liked it when people thought that. He found that he would get a good seat at restaurants and that sort of thing if they thought he was related to Dwight. But we did a Zoom meeting with Harry about a year ago. He's 101 years old, and he had some fascinating stories to tell about his time in Italy. Every individual web page basically has a blurb or an overall bio of the vet. And if you go down a little bit, you'll see a video player, and beneath the video player, a number of different titles. Rather than have the interviews play as one big hour-long interview, we divide them into, say 5 or 10-minute segments. And this we do to be student friendly so that students can click on individual veterans and learn about particular aspects of their career. And Don, like you, Harry was in both Italy and the Netherlands, and he's got some fascinating stories to tell about his time with the Nova Scotia Regiment. And a little bit further down, many veterans are really happy to contribute their photos. And Harry contributed this one. This was at his 100th birthday party. He was still able to fit into his old major's uniform from the Second World War. Just a fascinating guy, and it really was, our honor to be able to get to meet him that night. So that's how the page works. And there are literally hundreds of stories on there that you can go and learn about. And it's all about getting the students to interact with the veterans. When we started this project about 15 years ago, the veterans would come right into the classroom. But as time went by, that just became less and less possible. Even back then, the vets were mostly in their late 80s and early 90s. So my students were always very happy to pose for photographs. Then at a certain point, I started taking the students to meet the veterans, and I would, put 3 or 4 students into the back of my car and safely drive to wherever the veterans were. And this is a number of us interviewing Charles Scott Brown, a very well-known Canadian Normandy veteran. And one of the students I brought along, Ariel, who's in 4th year university. I'm sure she's thrilled to see an old picture of herself in her high school uniform there. And the students, of course, love doing selfies, needless to say, whenever we do a get-together with veterans. And the big shift in the last year or two has obviously been the fact that we now do these interviews in Zoom. And I made a point of including a photo here with somebody you guys all recognize. We did an interview with Mark Spiridigliosi just a few weeks ago, and it was a really, really nice session where the students got to learn about his story. So I asked 2 students to come along tonight, and I'll drop out a share screen here for just a second because this program is very much about the students and what they get from it. So I'm going to ask my current student, James Zabo, and James is in a couple of my grade 12 classes. I asked him to talk a little bit about the Oral History Project because James has been involved in quite a few interviews. So James, the floor is yours. What do you want to say about the Oral History Project?
Yeah, awesome. I'm honored to be able to speak at this event, and I loved the opening music. It took me completely by surprise, and it was wonderful. I thought I'd tell you a little bit about why I do the Oral History Project. I think that in Canada, I don't know about in the US, but on November 11th, we say, lest we forget, because we never want to forget the atrocities of war. And part of the reason I do these interviews is because speaking to veterans in person or on Zoom, like we're doing right now, brings the history alive, and it gives you something you can't get from a textbook. And those memories are really powerful, and they stick with you. And I'm confident that I'll be able to pass those on to my kids and keep them alive for generations, so that we never have to go to war again, and we can keep that peace. Also, who else can talk about literally saving the world, like quite literally saving the world and protecting our democracy? And I remember one of the most memorable interviews I did was with a 109-year-old named Ruben Sinclair, and he's coming up on 110 soon. And it was just amazing to hear some of the stories he had, and just such a long, beautiful life. And that's really why I do the Oral History Project.
Very well said, James. Thank you for that. Now, James, you're of course welcome to stick around for a bit, but I'm sure you have homework to do tonight too. So we don't want to keep you from that if you have other things. I didn't assign him any homework tonight, by the way, but somebody else might have. I also brought a student tonight by the name of Ariel Mayer, and Ariel's in 4th year university now at University of Toronto, studying history-related subjects, which is fantastic. And when she was in high school, she did more interviews than any student I've ever had. I think Ariel and I did something like 60 interviews together with military veterans and Holocaust survivors. And she really grew into just a fantastic part of the project. And when she was in grade 12, I believe, Ariel, she wrote an essay about some of her experiences, which actually won a national award from Canada's History Society. And I asked Ariel if she would read a couple of excerpts from that, because I think they're very powerful.
Thank you so much. So, hi, my name is Ariel Mayer, and I've been a part of the Crestwood Oral History Project for about 6 years now. So the first interview that initially got me started with the project was in the 10th grade, where I spoke with my grandmother, who is a Holocaust survivor from France. And this interview marked me for a number of reasons. First of all, this was my grandmother, and so this was a story that was really close to my own heart. When I heard her story and all that she went through, I was sort of watching my own history unfold before my eyes. And the second reason that this interview marked me to the extent that it did was that it sort of awakened this drive within me. My grandmother, she spoke emotionally of a younger brother who was killed in Auschwitz and is only able to remember him now by a name and a number indicated on a convoy record, convoy number 68. When I heard this, I realized that her younger brother, Henri, was given a voice. He was sort of given a name and an identity through my grandmother's voice. So when we record these testimonies as part of the Oral History Project, not only are we documenting the lives of those who have survived, but we're also documenting the lives of those who did not. After coming to this realization, I suddenly became driven to give voice to those who have been silenced and to name those who would have existed only as numbers. And this, to me, is the essence of the Oral History Project. In 2017, I conducted an interview with Mr. Charles Scott Brown, who was a veteran that fought on D-Day. And listening to his story reminded me of my grandmother's as I began to realize the correlation between the two. Whenever I think about my grandmother's story, I remember the lives of the soldiers who helped to liberate Europe. And I'm always aware during these interviews that without these soldiers and without them marching into those beaches in Normandy, my grandmother would not be here, and I certainly would not be here. So if there's one lesson that we should take from the Oral History Project, it's this one. We all have a shared history. And I only have a history because of the survival of my grandmother and because of military veterans like Mr. Charles Scott Brown.
I miss having you in class, Ariel. That was really, really good. So Ariel's in fourth year university, and she just applied to Oxford. I wrote her a reference letter, and Ariel, I know we're all wishing you best of luck. I'm sure you're going to get really, really good news there.
Okay.
So what I wanted to do, kind of going from that, she's a tough act to follow. I think you guys can all plainly see that. I'll go back into the slides I put together and kind of give a little bit of Canada's wartime history. But the main thing I want to do tonight is obviously to introduce these 4 awesome veterans who are with us and to have them share their stories about their particular moments in the war. But I'll try to give a narrative that sort of weaves it all together. And I'll start with a date that's very obvious. Everybody is well aware of the significance of September 1st, 39, the beginning of the Second World War in Europe. To relate that to Canada, you have to start thinking about events on September the 3rd. The British and the French declare war. Appeasement is obviously at an end. And this immediately puts a lot of pressure on Canada. There was really no question that Canada was going to follow Britain's lead. But the Prime Minister, Mackenzie King, wanted to wait. Okay, he wanted to demonstrate that Canada had gained its independence, which really happened after the First World War. So he waited a week before asking Parliament to do a vote, and it was essentially unanimous. Canada declared war on Germany and was going to support the British war effort. There really wasn't any kind of doubt about that. Now, Mackenzie King might not be a familiar name to Americans. I'll show you an image of Mackenzie King that you might be a lot more familiar with for anybody who has traveled in Canada. What you also might notice is that he was Canada's Prime Minister for a really long time, about 24 years in total, including through all of the Second World War and a big chunk of the Great Depression. I don't think Mackenzie King had the kind of charisma of Winston Churchill or Franklin Roosevelt. He definitely didn't, but he was a good politician, and he was really good about responding to the needs of Canadians during this period of time. Glenn referenced this a couple of moments ago, but a big promise that Mackenzie King made at the start of the war was that there would be no conscription in Canada. And if you're unfamiliar with that word, conscription in Canada has the same meaning as the draft in the United States. So Glenn already referenced that this would be a largely voluntary war effort. And it comes down to this decision that King made. And the reason was because in the First World War, when conscription was implemented, it caused a very significant split between French and English Canadians. And Mackenzie King didn't want to go down that road again in the Second World War. As it turns out, there will be partial conscription or a limited level of the draft introduced, but only at the end of the war. And it really doesn't affect too many Canadian soldiers. These are the stats in terms of what Canada was facing at the start of the war: a tiny army, very little modern equipment, and just really not ready for the demands, certainly, that this war was about to throw Canada's way. But Canadians were excited, and in the early going, the first month of the war, you can see close to 60,000 men volunteer. And a lot of that, of course, had to do with the reality of the Depression. Many men were joining up because it was about meals, it was about a paycheck, but the numbers are big, and it's a voluntary effort. And for those of you who might be unfamiliar, this was the flag of Canada at the time. So the Canadian veterans were fighting under this flag, and the connection to Britain, was really quite obvious. But the numbers are significant, and Canadians are ready to do their part and to go to war. And the first forces start to go overseas as early as December. And that's going to lead us to the first veteran who I want to speak to you guys tonight. And we're going to be joined by Ken Lett in just a couple of moments. But a very young Ken Lett, you can see right here, is going to join the Royal Canadian Air Force. And here he is getting his wings pinned on him by none other than Mackenzie King himself. And I'll let Ken tell you the story there. It's an absolutely fantastic one. And what Ken ends up going into is a program that was known as the British Commonwealth Air Training Program. More than 100,000 aircrew from all over the British Empire and Commonwealth were trained in Canada. Big, safe, open skies, of course. And Ken's going to take part in that program as well as it happens. So Ken's webpage can obviously be accessed here. You can see that we met Ken in a Zoom interview last year. And it was absolutely fantastic. Ken is joining us from British Columbia, by the way. But here we have Ken after the war with his first wife, and you can probably tell from these photos that Ken goes on to have a pretty long career in the Air Force. Ken, I think you were in the Air Force for a total of 35 years, was it? Oh, Ken, if you could unmute yourself, please. Oh, we still can't hear you, Ken.
Okay. How about now?
There we are. Perfect. So
Okay.
Ken, first of all, Ken, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I was wondering if you could give people a sense of why you decided to volunteer. Why did you join the Royal Canadian Air Force?
I think it was a pretty simple decision to make. All the youth in the Ottawa Valley, in the area I grew up in, were in the Air Force or in the Army or the Navy. And I have to say, I would have felt almost lonely if I hadn't joined up. There was nobody else left around, particularly in the high school era. I had one other friend in high school who was not medically fit, and that's all. I was the only medically fit person during my high school years that still lived in town. Also, in my case, I was a worshiper of the hero Billy Bishop, and my only interest was trying to be another Billy Bishop.
And Ken, if I could ask, a lot of Americans might not know the name Billy Bishop. Who was he?
Billy Bishop was the hero of World War I who shot down 75, something like that, German airplanes, and left a big impact on the Air Force.
And in terms of the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, Ken, do you remember which bases you trained at?
Yes, St. Eugene, which is halfway to Montreal from Ottawa, and Uplands, Brandon, Manitoba, and Trenton, Ontario.
And how long did that take?
The flying part was St. Eugene and Uplands, Ottawa International.
How long did that take approximately, the training?
I think about a year from I joined up, I got my wings.
And you had a great story, I recall, about your first flight. What was your first flight like?
The instructors in the elementary training school, in my case, it was Fleet Finch's a biplane, were all old bush pilots. And I happened to get a really good one. His thought was, you gotta love flying, it's fun. And he taught us to do things. I refer to the inverted falling leaf, engine off, controlling the nose on the horizon, and just making the wings go up and down. After you've done that with some degree of accuracy, it's pretty hard not to love flying.
And of course, you ended up getting your wings in that really famous photograph I showed a couple of moments ago.
Yes.
How did you find yourself in the position of getting pinned by the Canadian Prime Minister?
I think the only thing that I remember was it was a cold day, and you notice he has a greatcoat on. And
It's not quite
we were a long time listening to him make a speech, for want of a better word, and shivering and thinking, please, you notice that he's got his got a greatcoat on. It was a very cool day, and we marched from Uplands Airport to Parliament Hill and did our wings presentation with whatever number of people we had. I think something like 40. And then we were gone, in my case, overseas.
So, Ken, when did you end up going overseas? Would it have been 1944?
43.
43. And of course, you end up getting assigned to a Spitfire squadron, which I'm sure was your dream. What was it like the first time you got to fly a Spitfire?
Well, the airplanes that I had flown in training were essentially underpowered. And when you put the foot down in a Spitfire, you go very much overpowered by comparison, as it needed to be a fighter. But they were a pretty nice airplane to fly.
And when did you first fly a combat mission?
Oh, I'd have to look at my logbook to tell you the date. I don't know, but it was probably 6 months after I arrived in the United Kingdom.
And do you remember what kind of missions you would have been flying in the early going?
Yes, we, before the invasion, we did what we called ramrods. And that was going out on the deck as close to the ground as you could get away with and shooting at anything that moved. And hopefully you didn't get shot at. We did quite a bit of that. And that was coupled with escorts. And the escorts were medium bombers of the United States Air Force. And we escorted them regularly. But that was short range stuff. We didn't have the range to go with, say, the Flying Fortresses. That was the Mitchells and the Boston size airplanes. And we pretty much were busy doing that until D-Day, and then the world changed.
That's a good way of putting it. And we'll talk about your role in D-Day in a little bit. Sean and Ellie, if people want to ask questions as we go along, by all means, but we'll kind of go back and forth between the different veterans. So just interrupt me if I miss somebody with a raised hand or something like that.
Not a problem. We'll do that also. We have some great turnout over here on YouTube and Facebook. So Welcome everyone on those two platforms. If you have a question, please type it in your chat and we will make sure to ask it on the program.
Perfect. So I'll go back into my presentation and we'll come around to Jack in just a couple of moments there, but let me bring that back up on screen. Okay, so Ken is obviously part of the Royal Commonwealth, the British Commonwealth Air Training Program. He goes overseas as a member of the RCAF. I wanted to put a map up for a moment. Just this kind of goes to what I said before, but the maple leafs represent, you know, a location in the war where Canada was particularly involved, and you can obviously see the vast majority of them across the North Atlantic and into Europe. Obviously, home front. There were some Canadian troops in North Africa, some in the Far East. Okay, but Canada's role in the Pacific War again was very minimal. There was one effort in the early part of the war right here to support British forces in Hong Kong, but the Japanese attack on Hong Kong was basically done simultaneously with Pearl Harbor, and the Canadian forces there were absolutely overwhelmed. The maple leafs in India, Burma, and Ceylon, Sri Lanka, mostly represent the efforts of the Royal Canadian Air Force, who were involved in that part of the campaign. But again, for Canada, the focus is absolutely going to be Europe and the North Atlantic. And as far as the North Atlantic is concerned, I think American audiences can certainly appreciate the significance of the Battle of the Atlantic. Keeping Britain supplied during the entire war was a critical part of Canada's war effort, proportionately probably the most significant part of Canada's overseas role. And in the early going, of course, Canadian convoys were attacked and victimized by the wolf packs and German U-boats. But as the war went along, the situation began to improve. The technology improved, the kind of ships improved, and they were able to take on the U-boat menace and effectively conquer the North Atlantic by 43 going into 44. A lot of you guys have probably seen the Tom Hanks movie Greyhound, which depicts the Canadian and American navies obviously cooperating in the North Atlantic. And we're very lucky to be joined by somebody who can talk about this firsthand. So I wanted to call upon Jack Reid, and you'll see that Jack has a smile just as great now as it was back when he was a teenager in the Navy. A very mischievous smile, and we'll see if we can get him to share some of those stories. So Jack, I wanted to ask you the same question that I asked Ken a couple of moments ago. What prompted you to join up? Why were you so excited to go off and serve?
Well, we were still living in the memory of World War I. As a matter of fact, all the kids used to do practice drilling, and the guys that I hung around with, we all joined the Reserve Army when we were 16 and drilled every once a week and went out on missions on the weekend. But everybody just was for country and king sort of thing. So I joined when I was 18. My buddy and I were working as police cadets for the Toronto Police Department. We went down to HMCS York. At that time, the big exhibition center was closed, and the military took over the different buildings, the permanent buildings, and we were in the automotive building. The Army and Air Force were in the Coliseum. But anyway, I joined and took my shots, got issued with all my equipment, and we were loaded in an old stake truck and taken down to the Union Station and got on a train there and went to Charlottetown. It was a 2-day trip in one of the old colonial coaches. And we did some basic training in Charlottetown and did some basic training in Halifax. Stadacona was another brick frigate, we called it. And then we did a 3-week course on radar operating, and I became a radar operator. So that's how I got into it, and made some very good friends, and through basic training, we had a pretty good time.
How many convoys did you end up doing during the war, Jack?
14. according to the log, yeah. And what we did, I was assigned to a frigate. It's a bit bigger than a corvette. It has twin screws instead of a single screw, carries a lot more fuel, so it can stay out longer. But I was sent to Newfoundland and on the HMCS Longueil. That's the Anglo pronunciation. The Franco pronunciation is Longueil, which I've since learned to call it the Longueil. But we took convoys from Newfoundland to Great Britain and dropped them off in Glasgow and Liverpool and around the island. And then we would sail up the Foyle River into Londonderry, which was our port on that side, and refuel and stock up with food and sail out and take another convoy, mostly empty this time, back to Newfoundland. And they really had a great system worked out because we were on the mid-ocean escort, they called it, but there was another group that picked up freighters in Boston, Halifax, New York, and brought them all up to Newfoundland. So they kept the subs away from Boston up to Newfoundland, and then we took them across from there to Britain. There was 6 ships in the escort group, 2 frigates, and 4 smaller ships, a corvette.
Probably Debbie was with them.
And Jack, the convoys that you were in, did any of them ever come under attack by U-boats?
Oh yeah, we lost some ships, and my job on board was radar operator, like 24 hours a day. But if the Aztec people detected a submarine, then we went into action stations. And my job in action stations was a depth charge thrower on the starboard side. So that was an interesting time too. The depth charges, I don't know whether you want to talk about that. They were like a big garbage can full of high explosive. And they had a timer, you set the timer, and that would allow them to sink so far below the surface, down where they thought the sub was, before they exploded. So at the end of the action, you had the key from the timer, and you had to show that you timed it so that it would explode.
Yeah, I can't bend about he's talking.
I beg pardon?
Oh, I think that was just Ken and Pat that we heard there.
Okay.
Now, I think, Jack, as I recall, you had a story where you saw an oil tanker explode basically right in front of you in one of those convoys.
Oh, yeah. That was quite a sight. It was pretty close, and it was loaded. Like the tankers, they put them inside the convoy if they could. And this one got a torpedo, and it was just gone in a flash. Really, it was a huge explosion. So nobody would survive from that. And of course, we that would then be looking for the submarine that fired the torpedo. But that was a tough job too, because you had to stay with the convoy. You could spend a little time on it, but you still had to try and protect the rest of the convoy. And at that time, later on in the war, the Germans started doing wolf packs, where they would gather with about 8 at a time. So, and we would zigzag all the way across the Atlantic. And I know one time we went away up around Iceland to avoid that pack of submarines. On the ship, there was a crew that ran we called it Huff Tuff, high frequency detection. And it would try and pick up radio signals from German submarines. And all convoys on the ocean had that. So they would try and figure out where the subs were by crossing the signals from the different subs. So it seemed to work out pretty well.
And I know one of the questions Navy vets are often asked, it's always a good answer, the weather. What's your story of the worst weather you encountered?
Oh, the worst was, of course, we were there in the wintertime, and a real storm, and it'd blow the spray onto the ship and it would ice up on the rigging. So you'd have to go out and chop the ice off the rigging. They were concerned, especially with the corvettes, that if you've got enough ice on them, they could turn turtle. And of course, when you had those real bad storms, we took up about 100 ships in the convoy sometimes. You get into a real bad storm, and these guys were streaming. There's maybe 7 or 8 lines that cross, and they're streaming right behind each other. And of course, in the storm, they'd have a heck of a job staying in their position. So then after the storm, we'd have to go around and see if we could get them all back into a convoy form again. But slept in a hammock, and you had your sea boots right below your hammock, and you had your clothes on, so you're ready to jump in and go if the alarm went. All the rest of the signals at that time were still done with a bosun's pipe to tell you what to do. So the original, yeah.
I was just going to say, you have some fantastic pictures that definitely give a sense of exactly what was going on. So I'll just go ahead and bring that up again so people can see. I guess this one in the lower right is obviously what the really heavy weather would have looked like.
Yeah, yeah.
And is that you in this picture, Jack, or is that one of your crewmates?
That was one of the crewmates. That's on the rear deck, and those 2 things on the side of the picture, they're the depth charge drawers. And you had 2 on each side, and the rail right at the back of the picture, right behind his hat. I'm trying to remember his name now to show the picture, but they had 2 sets of depth charges on rails, and they would just let them roll down the rail and drop over the side. But that's the gang that was, we were in the starboard flats. It wasn't originally intended to be a mess, but there was 12 of us sleeping and eating in there. It was a little crowded, but a good bunch of guys. We got along great. So we even had a couple of reunions a few years back, which were great to attend too.
And did you
quick question, Scott? Sorry to interrupt. Lisa Refner here in the chat said, was the film, and Jack, I'm not sure if you saw the film Greyhound with Tom Hanks, was the film Greyhound story somewhat true to what the convoys experienced with regard to the German U-boats embedding themselves within the convoys?
Yeah, it was like any movie. It was a little overdone in my mind, but I enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thanks, Lisa. Go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, and we have some other great pictures here. You mentioned the heavy weather, and obviously you get a sense of the heavy weather in an image like this. But I also like the fact that Jack included this photo, which doesn't look like the weather was quite so bad on that particular day.
No, sometimes we went away south to avoid the U-boats, and if there was no action, then you could relax a little bit and get out in the sun. But most of the time we were in gray weather. As a matter of fact, in Newfoundland, when we got into port, they even took us and put us under sun lamps for a while to try and get us some of the vitamin D, I guess. But,
and I have to ask Jack, I'm sure everybody's thinking it, a photo like the one we just looked at, were you guys getting your rum ration at that time?
Every day at 11 o'clock, the bosun's pipe up spirits, and the officer of the day, whoever he was, would go down, and there's a big keg of rum there, and dole it out into a little cup. You had a tin cup, and you're supposed to drink it right away, of course, but people would flatten the tin out and put it down the front of their dungarees and try and save the rum for when they got ashore. But the captain found out about that and started to water the rum down 2 water to 1 rum, and it wasn't very palatable. So that kept you from saving it anyway.
Okay, I should move on and talk to our soldiers here in the next couple of moments. But I think there's a pretty important part of Canada's wartime history to address at this point. And none of the men who are joining us tonight were veterans of the Dieppe Raid, but the Dieppe Raid is a pretty important piece of background for understanding the stories of Don and Jim, who you'll hear in the next couple of moments. Dieppe was, of course, the cross-channel raid that the Western Allies planned for the early part of 1942, and then it got rescheduled, you can see, until the later part of the summer 42. And quite frankly, it was just a disaster in every way you look at it. 5,000 Canadian troops were selected for this. Some Canadian soldiers had been in England already for 2 years plus at this point, and they were getting very restless. The command was looking for something to give them to do. And this raid was settled upon. It was always intended to be just a one-day cross-channel venture, arrive in France in the morning, do the mission, and then get out by the end of day. And there's endless debate about exactly what the intent of this was. The real story is what ends up going wrong. Of the 5,000 Canadian soldiers selected, almost 1,000 are killed, 2,000 are wounded, and 2,000 end up being taken prisoner of war for the remainder of the war. Just an absolute military disaster. The timing was off, the communications was off. They attacked a fortified port city where the Germans had the high ground. And by high ground, I literally mean cliffs that surrounded, where they were just firing down on Canadian soldiers who were, in some cases, a mile from their intended landing zone. Some of you might have seen the famous images of the pebble beaches where the tanks attempted to go ashore and they just couldn't move when the treads ended up getting full of all these little pebbles. It was an absolute military disaster, and I think certainly the darkest day of the war for Canada in many respects. What does become important for our story here is really the lessons that are going to be learned. And those lessons are, of course, going to be put to use, certainly in Normandy, but in Italy before that. Italy, everybody knows, was Winston Churchill's real point of emphasis at this time. He quite famously tried to sell Italy as the soft underbelly of Europe, thinking that an attack from the south in the Mediterranean region would be the best route. And we have the opportunity here tonight to be joined by Mr. Don White, who served in this campaign. So, Don, I wanted to ask you to begin, was Italy the soft underbelly? Oh, you have to unmute there, Don.
Can you hear me now?
Very good. Go ahead. So, was Italy the soft underbelly?
No, it was far from it. There was many tough battle fought in Italy.
And I guess a lot of that had to do with the terrain. What was the geography that you were battling through there?
Well, there's a mountain range right down the middle of Italy, and then on each shore, or the mountains go down to kind of a plain, and then the ocean and the water. And Americans were on the left-hand side, and we were with the British on the right-hand side, the Adriatic side.
Exactly. And of course, the really well-known Canadian battle, I suppose, from this part of the war would be Ortona. But you came in after Ortona, right, Don?
Yes, Ortona was in December 43. And that was about halfway up Italy by that time, because they landed in Sicily and came over to the mainland and got that far by 43.
Exactly.
December of 43.
But I wanted to take a quick step back, Don, and sort of get a sense of what prompted you to volunteer. And there are obviously some great images here relative to your own war story. Don was part of the Royal Canadian Dragoons in the First Corps. Why did you decide to volunteer, Don?
Well, I think it was a little bit. My dad's three brothers were in the First World War, and I heard a lot about it. And I think, same as the other gentleman, there was a little bit of patriotism. And I think in the back of my mind was we better go over there and stop them before they come over here. And to be honest with you, I really think part of it was the girls like a guy in uniform.
I think that's a story we've all heard. And with that, I'm just looking for another photograph of you here so that I can do a quick share screen. Ah, there, I got it there. Let me go ahead and bring that up for everybody to see. How old were you when you joined up, Don? And there's a great picture in that uniform that hopefully impressed all the ladies.
I joined up when I was 16 in the militia, like your friend in the Air Force, but I joined the regulars in 18.
And this photograph here, would this have been taken in Italy, or was this when you were doing basic training?
That will be in Dundurn, Saskatchewan. Basic training.
And I'm curious, looking at a picture like this, so you're 18 years old, how much did you weigh?
Well, I was in fighting trim and I weighed the same weight. I weighed 118 pounds.
So they send you overseas. Did you choose to be part of the Dragoons, or were you assigned to that regiment?
No, I was assigned to it because went over to England and then from England down to Italy and then joined the regiment in Italy. The regiment actually landed in Sicily and I didn't join them until they were up the coast.
And what was the job of the Dragoons? I thought you guys had an absolutely fascinating, difficult job, both in Italy and the Netherlands.
Well, we were a reconnaissance regiment. And in Italy, because of the lines being more static, there wasn't much wrecking to do. And the only time you did any wrecking was when there was an advance from one position to another. So consequently, we served, I think, as much time being infantry soldiers as we did recce soldiers.
And let me bring that image up again of you and your vehicle. You had a great line about that vehicle. Why don't you tell people about what you guys were driving around in?
Well, in our squadron, there was 5 recce troops, and a recce troop consisted of 2 dingoes and 2 taghounds, and the dingoes are 2-man scout cars and taghounds are 5-man scout cars with a turret on. But as you can see in the picture there, the Staghound had that what we called a 37 millimeter gun on it, but we nicknamed it a paint chipper because that's all it would do against the tank.
And you guys can see here the insignia, the color version of what Don's vehicle has right on the front there. And obviously in the black and white photo, you can't tell that the red shoulder patch. Who's this guy with you in the photograph here, Don?
That's Reese, one of the guys in our troop.
And when you think about Italy, I mean, you were in Italy, I guess, for about a year or so. What's the thing that you...
Not quite, but almost, yeah.
What's the thing that you most remember about the Italian campaign?
Well, I kind of remember maybe the fall and winter of 44 when the weather turned against us and it was a static line and being in the mud and the rain. And I think the thing I remember the most about Italy that we were along the Senio River, Christmas of 44, and Germans were on the other bank. And I think to explain it, the rivers in Italy are all have embankments up each side to keep them from flooding in the spring. So you kind of were behind the bank, you might say. So we were there at Christmas time, and Christmas Eve, we kind of heard some commotion over in the German lines, and we kind of alerted us a bit, and we kind of paid more attention, and we finally deciphered that they were singing, and we decided they were singing Christmas carols. So we decided that we should join in and see if we could outdo them. So for about an hour, there was a lot of Christmas music across that Senio River.
That's a great story. That reminds me of the Christmas truce of 1914.
Yeah, well,
Now,
also I like to finish that off then in this respect, that Christmas Day, on our front, there wasn't a shot fired or a shell or a mortar.
And when did you get transferred out of Italy? The first Canadian Army, you guys were fighting under British jurisdiction, I guess, for most of the Italian campaign.
We were with the British Eighth Army in Germany, in Italy, all the way up Italy. And in December of 45, not December, January of 45, they decided to pull the Canadians out of Italy and take us up to the European campaign up in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. And when we got there, we stopped. We got on landing barges in Lake Horn, Italy, and went across to Marseille, France. Drove our vehicles up to Orslaw in Belgium and stopped there for about 2 weeks or 3 weeks to refit. And then we headed out from there into Belgium, and about the middle of Belgium we started in, and we never stopped until the war ended.
Scott, if I may interrupt, I have two questions here
Sure.
for Mr. White. One from Glenn Flickinger. Don, what did you think of being under the British commander Bernard Montgomery, and did you ever see him?
No, I never saw him. And actually, see, by this time, Montgomery had left and gone up to take part in the invasion of the Normandy. So we were actually under Alexander for a lot of the time in Italy.
And also from the YouTube side, Paulo from Brazil is joining us on YouTube, and he asked, Don, which theater was the most challenging for you, Italy or Northwest of Europe?
Well, actually, in my experience in both places, there were kind of two different things. We actually, when we hit the north in Europe, we were doing what we were trained to do, being reconnaissance. So it was kind of up our alley.
And I also see Trey. Thanks for joining us tonight. Trey, you have your hand up.
Yes, I do.
How's it going tonight, Trey?
Good. One of my questions for Mr. White was about technology. Again, as a tank nerd, I really like the Staghound. I think it's a great armored car. But I really actually don't think it was up to the task in Italy, because what you have is you have a light armored car going up against a massive German line with stuff like Panzer IVs and heavily dug in artillery cannons. And I wanted to get, and again, this goes into my philosophy of getting a veteran's opinion before I make an opinion myself about something during the war. What did you think of this Staghound? What type of vehicle did you think that it was? Because I think it would be a cool vehicle. I think it's a neat vehicle. What do you think?
Well, it served the purposes for what we had to do, because actually we didn't come up against armored like German tanks. That wasn't our job to fight a German tanks. It was to find out where they were and come back safe and report our findings, the strength of the enemy and where they were. And so it was a fast vehicle, so we could get out of harm's way in a hurry. And I'll have to admit that we probably used more smoke bombs and grenades than we did shells.
And Don, when's the last time you had the opportunity to be in the Staghound?
About 3 years ago.
Do they have one at the Oshawa Museum just outside Toronto?
They had one there, and it's in tip-top shape, but then they sent it back to the regiment in Petawawa.
It's running.
Okay, and I should go back into share screen here to continue because I want to hear from Jim, and then Dawn will come back to you in a few moments when we talk about the Netherlands. So let me get my presentation up here again. And you guys, everybody certainly recognizes what we'll talk about a bit next, because it ends up being a pretty substantial part of the Canadian war effort and the American and British war efforts for that matter. And that's obviously June 644, Operation Overlord, the attack on the Normandy beaches. I was always bothered a little bit by this map because it shows the new Canadian flag. Technically, it should be the old Canadian flag pictured there, but everybody knows, of course, that Canada was given its own beach, which ends up being codenamed Juno Beach. Kind of famously, it's a little trivia thing. It wasn't originally going to be called Juno Beach. Montgomery, who was asked about before, he wanted to give the fish code names to all the British beaches. So gold and sword, goldfish and swordfish. And the original plan, believe it or not, was to use the code name Jellyfish or Jelly Beach. The Canadians did not like that idea at all. So the Canadian Wing Commander, one of the Air Force commanders, a guy by the name of Donné, petitioned Montgomery to change it, and it just so happened that Donné's wife's first name was Juno, and we end up with Juno Beach. And this, of course, is going to be the beach where thousands of Canadians are going to go ashore on the morning of June the 6th. And we're lucky to be joined by one of the men who was in that very first wave of attackers. So I'm going to call upon Jim Parks here in a moment. Jim was part of the Winnipeg Rifles, and he went ashore in the very first landing wave and the very first moments on Juno Beach. And Jim just has endless, incredible stories to tell. And I'm going to ask him, in addition to that, to talk about this famous video in a couple of moments that probably a lot of you guys have seen. Not too many times in life do you get to have one of the attackers on D-Day narrate a video of exactly what his regiment was doing. But here we have Jim before the war on a hockey team. And Jim, I want to ask you to begin with, when you were playing hockey in the 1930s, how come none of the guys on your team are wearing the same jersey?
Well, actually, those jerseys we did. That was in the spring of 1940, and we didn't have our own uniforms, so they borrowed a set of sweaters from the hardware store, and we wore them for the picture. And that's me in the left with number 1, and the other 2 fellows in front, they end up in the Army too. So that's how we got that picture. I was just 15 then. I was in reserve forces. And 3 months later, I was in the regular army in late August 1940.
And I'm sure everybody's doing the math there. How do you end up in the regular army at the age of just 15 or 16?
Well, I've been a cadet for a long time, and I've been in reserve forces. And what they did is at the reserve forces, they didn't look at your age. They took the nominal roll, and they issued what they call a selective service certificate, which is given to everybody over the age of 18. So when I volunteered for the regular army, they said, "How you have any proofs of age?" I said, "Yes, here's my selective service certificate." The sergeant winked at me and said, "You have to be 18. He's okay." So that's how I got in.
And when did you end up getting shipped overseas to England?
Well, we shipped over in September 41, and we spent the next 2 years training, different exercise and so on, until 1943 September. They sent up to Scotland, and we took 3 weeks of intensive assault landing training, and with first of all a platoon level, going right up to brigade level. And at each level we used live ammunition going in, and then we come back to England. We went to a place called someplace called Springston Sands on the southwest coast of England, and did a major exercise, which was a rehearsal for D-Day. They had several divisions, including the destroyers and all. In fact, there was one destroyer, American destroyer, was sunk offshore by U-boat at the same exercise. It was
And I'm sorry, Glenn, I remember having a preliminary conversation with you. You know, we talked about the fact that some Canadian soldiers were in England for a really long time. So a very young Jim was in England for about 2 years. What do you remember, Jim, like when you reflect back on your time in England, when you weren't doing training, what were you guys doing?
Oh, we did a lot of regular exercises, and we were stationed along the south of England, and we were supposed to, our whole role was to be defensive, because initially they were concerned with the Germans would be invading England at the time. And so we were all stationed along the coast, and we had defensive positions, and most of the towns and the houses they evacuated the civilians, and there were very few of them around. There were stores, there were theaters, but there's sort of like a ghost town along the coast, and that's where we were stationed along that way, and we did that for about a year or two before the invasion, until we started taking a lot of heavy duty training in assault landing on landing craft and boats, and we were more into they think us the water rat. The water so often in the landing craft, and that we had problems, being on shore. So we're constantly taking different exercises, using different boats, first of all, we used to carry, I was in a mortar platoon, and they practiced landing. We jumped off the landing craft. Each one of us carried a piece of the mortar with 6-pound bombs, 6 times 10 pounds. That's 60 pounds of bombs. And I carried a base plate, which was 42 pounds, plus your rifle. And you jump into the bloody water, when you swallow a lot of the water. Then he decided to change that, and he decided to, actually 54 D-Day, he started to go in with our carriers. And we were actually landing for D-Day itself. We were in a landing craft, and we were supposed to land 2 minutes before the assault infantry, because we had 2 armored bulldozers in the front of the landing craft with long grappling hooks, and they were supposed to drop off first, use their grappling hooks to hook away the obstacles in the water. The only problem was we hit a mine, and it put a hole in the boat, and then they got hit by a shell, and the shell actually it kissed off the front of the bulldozer. Had blades on the front. It actually took off part of the blade of the bulldozer. But the thing is, they went to drop us in the water. We had our mortar carriage, and the water was too deep, and so the carriers sank, and we had to swim in. So we could see it was going to sink. So I just threw off my equipment like the rest of us did. As soon as it hit the water, we sort of swam in, and the infantry had just gone in just slightly ahead of us, and I got in beside. The first guy I saw was a friend I knew, a Corporal Scaife, who had been mortally wounded. So I took Corporal Scaife, a Sten gun, I rolled him over, took off his small pack, and I headed to the sand dunes, and I waited there for the rest of the platoon to come in. It was kind of hectic there for a while, because the first minute or so, there's still machine gun fire. The mortar fire didn't let up for a while, because we didn't get in far enough to take out the mortars, but they're still popping the bombs onto the beach. But the thing is, with the beach being sandy, a lot of the bombs would go into the beach, and thankfully would absorb a lot of shrapnel. So we're kind of lucky that way. But I got my bell rung a couple of times, and I got into since we lost everything, I ended up with TAC headquarters of the brigade. And an old neighborhood cop of mine was a sergeant major. He says, "Jimmy, I'd like to do some running." So I ran with the messages for about a half an hour, and I got sick, and I brought up all the seawater. And I sat beside this, I remember this tree, and I was just waiting until I get my bearings. And I got into this, I knew the path we're on, and I got into this house, and I waited for the rest of the platoon to come in. And we got into a village called Puteaux, about 8 miles inland. And the next day we got overrun by the 12th SS, put in a counterattack. That was about the 7th and 8th of the night, evening of the 7th. and the night of the 8th of June.
You were on the Zoom call, can I call you back?
Hello. They put in a
It's
counter.
okay.
They put in a counterattack, and we got overrun by the SS on the 8th of June. That was a hectic 2 days.
I can imagine. Wasn't your brother on the same landing ship as you?
Well, he was in the same landing craft. He's another landing craft. That was Jack, and he landed a bit later than I did. Well, when I say a bit later, it's hard to tell the time. And he was the first thing he did was started to look for me, you know. But you only look so much. And 2 days later, they put up. We were at our headquarters, and they put up a list of casualties on his telephone pole. And he checked the list, and he saw my name was on there, that I was okay. They put the survivors' names, so he saw my name on there. But I never saw him for about another 2-3 days. And since we lost our mortars, they attached us to, we had 6 mortars with carriers, and we lost our 2 on the beach. So they spread us among the other 4 mortar carriers. And so he was one of those. So I got reunited with him for that time. But it was a pretty hectic then. Then we got overrun a day later by the SS, and we still managed to survive. A hectic 2 days, in other words.
Absolutely. And Jack, I thought I would play the video of the Winnipeg Rifles landing. I think people would love to hear you narrate what is showing up on the screen. So let me go ahead and share screen again here, and we can play that. I'll play it without sound, Jim, so you can let people know exactly what it is they are looking at here. But these are the incredibly famous images of the Winnipeg Rifles going ashore.
Well, what happens is there's 3 lines of troops. The initial line was in the center. They're the first ones to go out. And then the other ones would mix in with them. This looks like they're going into the beach. There's a metal front on it. You see that's metal? It's about a 1/4 inch thick. It'll stop machine gun bullets as long as it's not armor piercing within 100 yards. It'll make a dent in it. So this is they're all ready to take off. You notice he's wearing a gas cape on the back. That's that round thing he's carrying in the back of his back. That fits over your head, and it goes right down to the ground. It's used. It's a pretty good thing to keep you warm in a trench too. So that's a landing on there's the obstacles in the water. A lot of them had mines on the end of it, and you had to be careful of those. So they used mine bottles, and the mine bottles was full of the dynamite or explosive, and you had a cap on the detonator cap on the top. If you touch one of those, it'd explode, and it'd be quite a hole. One of those obstacles, when I had to swim in, that's the first thing I grabbed was one of those obstacles, and I grabbed that, and it was quite a lot of waves, and it was pretty rough near the boat, near the shore. And the wind was going from right to left, and all the waves are coming from right to left. And it was pretty, as you got closer to shore, it got rougher and rougher. Our particular beach was kind of rough. And you can see the people taking off, and it's off on the back. And
how far would you have been from where this was taking place, Jim?
This is probably with the 8th Brigade, which is on our left, about 300 yards, 300 or 400 yards to our left. I could tell by the buildings, because we didn't have any buildings in our beach, but when our beach where they landed, the 8th Brigade, they had it was a small village there, but we had no village in front of our beach, strictly sand dunes and a bit of hills, and lots of barbed wire. We had lots of barbed wire there, and mines.
And I wanted to bring Ken Lett back into this for a moment. Now, Ken, you mentioned a little earlier that for you, D-Day was the day when everything changed. Do you remember where you were when D-Day took place?
Yes, I was in southern England in a base called Tangmere, and we were out. I think we were trying to maybe show that there might be some other area where the landing was going to take place, because we were far away from it, patrolling until about 1 o'clock in the morning. This is a Spitfire squadron flying formation at night with no lights. So they were getting kind of desperate for something to fill the air with. And we took off again at about 5 o'clock. And that was the spectacular sight that's still very much in my body. The English Channel looked like you could walk across it with craft. There was so much shipping. And we were looking down on it from about 20,000 feet. It looked like it was solid. It was an awesome sight, really. And from that point on, we went in behind the front line of the beach and tried to create some havoc, shooting up ground activities. There was nobody in the air that we were supposed to be guarding against it, that the Germans didn't show. I think they were running out of airplanes, running out of pilots, running out of fuel, everything at that point in the war. And the system anticipated a whole bunch of 190s and 109s trying to beat up the approach area. They never came near us at all. So we took our revenge by going inland and shooting up ground activities. I got lucky with one. It was a building and a refueling truck. And I shot at the truck, a little bit of skid on hit the building. And the building was a storage depot for fuel, and we saw an awfully big bang. Fortunately, I was shooting out of range, so we were able to avoid getting involved in it.
And Ken, would it have been, I'm sorry, go ahead, Sean.
Yeah, sure. Mary Klepper had placed a question here in the chat, wondering if any of the veterans on tonight, or if any of the students that have interviewed veterans for the Oral History Project have any of the vets talked about hauling planes by hand overnight from the U.S. border in the Lend-Lease Act?
I can remember one veteran we interviewed who talked about that, and he remembered there was a man by the name of Len Levy who we talked to years and years ago. He ended up becoming a Lancaster pilot from the very early part of the war. He remembered being stationed, I can't remember if it was Saskatchewan or Manitoba, but it was the dead of winter, and they were literally dragging planes over from a farm in North Dakota. And they had to do this all without motors in order to follow the very strict terms of Lend-Lease. But he remembered that as being about the coldest experience he ever had in his life.
Thank you,
But
Scott.
I don't think that came up in any of the interviews that Ariel or James did. He's the only one I remember talking about that. Ken, I was going to ask you, you were talking about your attacks on ground targets. I recall you were talking about one particularly tough day that you had during this part of the war.
I don't know. I had quite a few tough days.
I think there was one day in particular where you talked about losing several of the men you were flying with.
Oh, yes. In fact, 3. We were being led by our wing commander, who was a New Zealander. We had a wing with 3 different countries involved in it. And he took us in behind the front lines, and we were happily shooting at ground targets. I guess kind of enjoying it. But unfortunately, he decided to come out without climbing back up. And I lost the 3 guys I was leading. And the only thing that kept me alive was being an old farmer. And I saw a bunch of elm trees in this field. I figured that if I could stay below the limbs and the elm trees, they'd have trouble shooting at me. And I also knew that the elm trees grew high enough off the ground that there was room for an airplane. So I ended up being the only member of the section when we got back to England.
And Ken, I know you were flying a Spitfire largely in tactical missions. Did you ever get in any dogfights at all?
No, never Never saw a German airplane in the air. I was a little bit too late for that part of the war. That was Battle of Britain style, and shortly thereafter. I didn't get over there till after that period of fighting was over.
I did see somebody had sent in a question about what kind of aircraft you were flying. So I will go back to the presentation, and we still have lots of questions for the veterans, but Glenn and Sean, if you see a hand up and I miss it, by all means, please interrupt me. Let me go ahead back into share screen here. So this has to do with sort of coming out of the Battle of Normandy. Once the breakout ends up taking place, I'm sure you guys all recognize the green arrows of the American 1st and 3rd Army. The Canadians were given the task, I should say, of clearing out the coast. So the Canadian armies coming out of Normandy stuck to the coast alongside the Polish Armored Division you can see there. And the goal was to liberate the Channel ports, with the big emphasis being taking the city of Antwerp. The Allies really desperately needed a deep sea port to keep the advancing armies supplied. And that's going to end up involving really heavy fighting in this area, in what comes to be known as the Battle of the Scheldt. I think a largely unknown part of the war, where the Canadian armies were fighting in absolutely miserable, flooded wintertime conditions, moving through Belgium into the Netherlands. Really, really heavy losses during this period of time. Now, Jim Parks, I don't recall all of your stories in this regard, but were you involved in the fighting in the Scheldt, or were you to the south of there?
Well, I was in the Scheldt, all right, because that was a pretty wet, damp, muddy place to fight. And there are a lot of dikes around there, and there's a lot of polders, right? The polders is the area in between, and the water table is only about 6 inches below the surface of in the polders. If you remember, the polders is the area in between the dikes, right? So you had to dig into the side of the dikes. But we had a mortar, so what we had to do was take our ammunition boxes, which they contained the bombs, and we put these ammunition boxes in the ground. We sort of dug them in, and we put the mortar plate down and popped in a few bombs just to make sure they're secure. Because if you didn't do that, the barrel would go deep into the earth. So that was one way we were able to stabilize the mortars that way. And we had to make sure that we got our mortars behind the dikes, because you couldn't be out in the open. You'd be too exposed to machine gun or rifle fire. So by getting behind the dikes and make sure the dike was between you and the MG fire, that's the safe way to do it.
Did you guys take a lot of German prisoners during this period of time, Jim?
The odd time. I remember one time that we went to a crossroads, and we went to sort up our mortars there. We assumed it was all clear, and I walked out to the back of this house, and I looked across the courtyard, and I see this little white flag. I thought, what the hell is that? And then the next thing I know, this German soldier popped up, and he had his hands up. And he said "Kamerad," whatever it was, and I moved him over, and he had a big greatcoat, and the greatcoat had lots of pockets. And what he did, he's got into the larder of all the Dutch people had their larders with all their canned goods. There was canned pork, cans of vegetables, and so on. And he had his greatcoat pockets filled with all these goods. So what I did is take them down to I marched them back down through the back, past some of the dikes, and got into the rear. And there's a garage there, and one of the companies had a little portable stove set up. And so we ended up getting some of this food he had and putting on the stove. And I had to march this guy all the way back. But in the meantime, everybody else took all the food that he had out of his pockets and left it with the Dutch people there. But he reminded me of Sergeant Schultz. If you remember Sergeant Schultz in the program, I always think of that when I see Sergeant Schultz. I said, there's that guy that we had captured, He looked exactly like him. Big long coat filled with food. Yeah.
So I guess it was true in this time. The German army, a lot of younger boys and older men were making their way to the front lines.
That's right, there were. I remember marching one kid back. He kept looking at me and I kept looking at him. He was about 18 or 19. That was a Normandy. We had the Hitler Youth. And the odd time we end up getting captured, a few of them. And I remember marching along and the people the same age as I was, about 18 or 19, and I was 19 then. And he was what we walked along, he looked at me and I looked at him, and I got him back to the POW camp, and we had a small POW camp at our battalion headquarters, and left him there. I'll always remember walking with him. He was looking at me and I'm looking at him. I'll never forget that.
And I'll go back into share screen here. Sean's just reminded me of the time. We're going to aim to end at around 8:45 or so tonight, everybody. So I appreciate a little bit of extra patience, but there's a few more fantastic stories to hear before we end this evening. So let me go back into my presentation. So what Jim is talking about in terms of the Scheldt is a really significant prelude for what we're going to be getting into next. And in so many ways, this becomes the really critical and I think positive memory of the war for Canadians. And that's, of course, going to be the liberation of the Netherlands. And I know that Don and Jim and Ken, for that matter, have incredibly positive memories of this part of the war. But I wanted to ask somebody else to speak first, because I invited along a few friends from the Netherlands this evening, and one of them who is joining us is George Zwagstra, originally from the Netherlands, but nowadays he is living in Nova Scotia. So he is joining us, and it's getting late in Nova Scotia. It's 9:30 now. So first of all, George, thanks for wearing a coat and tie. You didn't need to go to all that trouble, but we appreciate it. George, I was wondering if you could share one or two of your stories from the end of the war, including your personal encounter with Canadian soldiers.
Yes, however, before I go into that, if I may, I received an email, and that email came from the Netherlands, from a friend of mine, and that email is for Don and Jim. And it says, "Hi, Don. I met you on the day that Gordon Bannerman passed away, on May 5, 2018, in Leeuwarden, the Netherlands. I was at your house in Canada, and we had some amazing conversation. This past June, I was in Normandy on the beach, and shortly I hope to be in Italy and hope to follow your route. Your stories are often told here, and will always be remembered." And the other one says, "Hi, Jim. I have met you in Friesland in the Netherlands and also in Canada. You took me to a place, I've forgotten the name, with Jim McPhee to do a flight in a B-25. You and Jim told some fantastic stories. I often tell them here. George, please tell all the war veterans, give them all the best from me, and thank Don and Jim for their service. David Lelyveld, Friesland, the Netherlands." Don, do you remember him? You remember him, Don?
Oh, you have to unmute there, Don.
Oh,
Yeah. Do you remember David Lelyveld, Don?
what was her name?
David Lelyveld.
Oh, David.
Oh, right, yeah.
Lilybeth, yeah.
Oh, man. Oh, that's so nice of her.
No,
Yeah.
him.
Or him, yeah, I
David.
appreciate it very much.
And Jim, do you remember him? Where are you?
Offhand, I can't.
I'm
yeah.
uncomfortable sitting
No,
here.
I must admit, I can't.
Whether we see the rest
The
of them or not.
filmmaker, David the filmmaker.
I can't even remember old names sometimes. No.
Yeah. So, yeah, I've gotten that
Jim.
way too. However, he asked me to, when he found out that we were going to be on this tonight, he asked me to do that for you too. Anyway, and this is actually, I have so much that I really want to tell, but we just don't have the time for that. But I'm a tour guide at Pier 21, the Immigration Museum, and I hear many stories. Over these last 13 years, I have met many war veterans, war brides, and many people that have survived the Holocaust. One thing that amazes me, and I want to thank each and every one here for their stories. It is so often that people don't want to tell their war stories. And I have one little incident that I like to mention tonight. I did a tour with a lady, and afterward the tour, she came up to me and she said, "George," she said, "I'm in history." And she said, "I have my grandfather served in the Second World War in Europe. I've been after him all my life to tell me his story. And he refused." And she said, "I asked him many times, and it came to the point that he got so aggravating that I just had to drop the subject." He went to a home, and after he got settled in for a few days, I went in to see him. And when I walked into his little apartment, I noticed a writing pad and a pen on the kitchen table. And he told me to sit down. And he said, "My grandfather told me his whole war history." When we were finished, he looked at me and he said, "You have to promise me one thing. Not one word of this is being told while I'm alive." And she said, I promised him. She said 2 days later, early in the morning before I went to work, I got a phone call that he had passed away. It is so important that we tell the stories about the wartime. We should never forget what happened there. Coming back to the war, yes, I was born in 1933, and in 1943, I was born in 93, and in 1943, I became a messenger boy for the resistance. My father was in the resistance, and my older brother was in the resistance, and there came a time that it was, I guess, my time. Now, my parents have never, ever after the war told us anything about the Second World War. It was just during the war we were told, don't ask any questions, because the less you know, the better, the safer it is for all of us. So we didn't ask any questions. I've always been interested in going to a concentration camp, and on our last trip to the Netherlands, we did go. Anyway, it is just 5 years ago, maybe now, that I received 1,000, just over 1,000 written pages that my dad had done about the family history. And one of the things, of course, he was writing about the time of the resistance, and also that he was known in the resistance as, if Zwagstra can do it, nobody can. He said, when I found that out for the first time, I told myself, wow, now I have to be careful. He goes on a bit about the war, and then it came, and that really, really got me. The Zwagstra family was on the list to be picked up to and go to the concentration camp. And who saved us? A collaborator with the Germans. This is a story that has not been told many times. The few people that have listened to that story have been after me to tell the story, because not many stories, if there are any, that a collaborator has saved the family of going to the concentration camp. Now, there's a lot more to this story, but it's just a bit too long to go through that. However, liberation. We were liberated in our little village on the 16th of April. The 1945, the 14th of April, we were told that they are on their way. We waited on the little square, village square, nothing happened. Saturday, nothing happened. Sunday, yes, they're coming today, nothing happened. Monday morning, a lot of people were at the little square. It was a foggy morning. And finally, the sun broke through the fog a bit. It was just as if it was a big carriage came from the sky. There was this big machine coming down the highway and turned off the highway to the village. The amazing thing is that the bridge at the time was up and they lowered the bridge. One fellow jumped off the vehicle, inspected the bridge, shook his head, went back to the vehicle and talked with somebody else there, and two of them came down and off the vehicle and came walking across the bridge. And one fellow to the crowd that was assembled there said, and I have to say this, that he did that in the Frisian language. He was in Canadian uniform. He spoke to us in the Frisian language and told us that we were free. He was a young fella that had immigrated to Canada way before the war, and he had made it his duty to liberate that part of the country where he was from. There are so many stories, and I can keep on going and going, but I'm afraid we don't have the time tonight. So thank you very much. And thank you to all the war veterans for what you have done for us. Thank you.
And thank you, George. And the good news is your story is on the Oral History Project as well, so people can always follow that up. I also wanted to introduce Claire Baum, who is with us tonight. And Claire, too, was a young girl in the Netherlands during the war. So, Claire, I'll put that image back on the screen. And if you could tell us a little bit about your own wartime memory and of the liberation. And, oh, sorry, Clara, you need to unmute there.
Okay, I was a hidden child during the war. And my grandparents were arrested. After that, my parents decided to put us into hiding. And of course, we were hidden by righteous Gentiles. And fortunately, we did survive because of the goodness. You will see all kinds of pictures here. First of all, I wanted to thank also the veterans that spoke this evening. I cannot thank you enough. Every single Remembrance Day, I go over to each and every veteran and I say, were you in Holland? Did you liberate us? You can see all kinds of pictures of us and the liberation. First of all, my sincerest gratitude to all of you. You are also my heroes. It was an honor for me to have met you tonight. I was a hidden child and liberated on May 5th in Rotterdam, Holland. A day I have never, ever forgotten. I owe my life to the courage and heroism of the Canadian Army, who against all odds had fought for our freedom, whereby unfortunately many of you had lost their lives in order to liberate our little country, Holland. When you look at this picture, you will see my sister and I on the Jeep, as a matter of fact, when it arrived in Rotterdam. How well do I remember May 5th, when the Canadians are liberated, marched into our city, Rotterdam. And after having been in hiding for 3 years without parents, with my younger sister, separated from our parents, we were finally free and reunited with the help of the Dutch resistance, but we especially owed our freedom to you men, Some of you are here, and the heroism to all of you. And to all the Canadian veterans, thank you for your courage, sacrifice, and heroism. I will never, ever forget you. And on Remembrance Day, I wear my poppy I couldn't find a poppy this time, but I wanted to wear my poppy proudly. Believe me, with the deepest gratitude. And I also want to thank you, Scott Masters. I have done a lot of speaking over more than 20 years. I've been talking my survivor stories. None of them can compare to the kind of presentation that I did for your school, including the backup information, the historical background. I've never had anything so complete. And also, I mean, maybe I can just take a little thing. My memoir is called The Hidden Package because there is a whole lot of stuff that's also included in my story. And if anyone is interested, it is available on the website. You can get it on the website. They're studying this particular liberation and what the Dutch did during the war and the veterans. It's all documented in my book. Thank you, and thank you everyone who is here tonight. And I'm very, very grateful that, for having me on. I'm glad there were a few more minutes that I could get on. I wasn't quite sure if there was time. And Ariel, I think you're doing an amazing job. And what else can I tell you?
Thank you.
If there's any questions, I'll be very glad to answer them. There's a lot in my book. Basically, my book is not just my story. I have decided that the Canadians didn't get enough credit. So I have given credit to the resistance. I've given credit to the forces and to all those people who really helped to survive me. I mean, I think if I put it on two hands, I don't think I have enough hands to even tell you how many people were directly and indirectly involved. My father was also a member of the resistance, and because he was a member of the resistance, he found us a place to be hidden. We were caught 3 times, fortunately escaped, and we were able to have our freedom. So I can tell you, I am very, very thankful to live in Canada. And this was the country that we really chose, and we were happy to be here. And I've got a wonderful life here in Canada. And thank you, all of you.
Thank you, Claire. And I'm so happy you could make it. Claire, by the way, is a Crestwood grandmother. Her grandson went to my school, and that's how I first got to know her. And she came and did a presentation for my class a number of years ago. I'll really quickly wrap up here, and I do apologize for running a little bit over time, but let me just go to the very last slide that sort of makes the point that I think all the participants have made. This is the war that in so many ways determines Canada's fate going forward. Canada modernizes, industrializes, of course, joins the United States in the post-war alliance, and ends up being a totally different place than it had been 6 years earlier, thanks to the efforts of all these men. And in school this week, we will celebrate this. These are images of past Remembrance Day assemblies. We've had so many veterans join us, and I've missed that so much over the last couple of years. A few years ago, Jim even came, and we had him outside on a very cold, snowy day, planting tulip bulbs, which are still in the Crestwood Garden. And of course, he did a fantastic presentation at the school that day as well. It's always meant an awful lot to me what these guys did. I've grown up hearing these stories, and I'm really happy that I'm able to get my students to hear those stories, and that I get to meet these men. It's like spending time with my grandfathers once again. So Sean, I think you said there was a few questions to conclude.
Yeah, a couple quick questions here. First, are Canadians buried overseas like American troops are? From Mary Klepper.
Yes, in a number of places, and I'm sure Don and Jim can speak to this more than I can. When's the last time you gentlemen were able to visit the Canadian cemeteries? Don or Jim?
2019, we were.
Yeah, I was there in 2018 at that Holton Cemetery, and 12 of my buddies are buried there.
2019 Bergenop Zoo.
Oh, in 2019, I visited Bergenop Zoo and laid a bouquet of white tulips that the Prime Minister donated to me on the cenotaph there.
And Jim, what about you? When's the last time you were able to visit the overseas cemeteries?
Oh, about a couple of years ago in his Normandy breakfast delays, Benny Mayer, there's about 7,000 Canadians buried in Normandy, so that's quite a few. And I was also up near Bergen of Zoom and Holton in Holland. I've been almost all the cemeteries that the Canadians are buried in. And in particular, I said there's 7,000 Canadians buried in Normandy and Breakfast Delays and Benny-sur-Mer. And I remember that most because we spent 10 weeks in Normandy. It was quite a battle because that's when the Germans were really in good strength, and those 10 weeks were pretty hectic. So that's why there's a lot of Canadians buried in Normandy.
Yep, absolutely. I visited those places myself.
Did the Canadians participate in Operation Market Garden?
Operation Market Garden, I've interviewed a few paratroopers. I don't think that there were Canadians involved in Operation Market Garden from what I recall. There were some, and actually the veteran that Ariel referenced, Charles Scott Brown, he was actually there. He had a really compelling story of escaping, where he was swimming across a river and ended up getting rescued by Polish troops. I don't think it was too many Canadians that were involved in Market Garden, though. They did do the Operation Varsity Drop in Germany a little later.
If I may mention, there were 6,000 Canadians that were in the Airborne Division, and one of the colonels of the Airborne Regiment was Colonel Jeff Nicklin, a Winnipeg Blue Bomber, former Winnipeg Bomber. He was killed in Holland around Arnhem. So there were quite a few Canadians involved, paratroopers around Arnhem in that area.
Hey, Scott, this is Glenn. If I could ask a question, how many Canadians gave the supreme sacrifice in World War II?
The approximate number was around 45,000.
45,000. Yeah, I can't do the quick arithmetic, but a very high rate of Canadians killed in action relative to the population of the country at that time.
Yeah, Scott, the population only was about 12 million.
Yeah.
Yep, there was about 1 million Canadians in uniform in some way, shape, or form, and 45,000 proportionately compares to the number of Americans killed.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yep.
And last, Trey, you have your hand up.
Yes, I do. I just wanted to say one thing about just say thank you to the veterans here. And it's been said so many times before, and it has to be said so many times in the future. And not only just to the veterans, to the resistance fighters that are in this call as well. As a Polish American, somebody with deep Polish roots, you hear a lot about the Polish resistance and the French resistance, but you have to realize, a lot of people have to realize that there were resistance movements like the Dutch resistance. And I think those forgotten resistance movements from some of the other countries really should be studied more than the other two, because the Polish resistance and the French resistance at this point have been just glorified so much, and then we forget about these other massive, brave, courageous resistance fighters. And then to the Canadian veterans, it's so, even as an American, as somebody who's been to Canada only once for 3 days, it's just so inspiring seeing everybody. I've talked to many different soldiers from many different nations. I've actually talked to some German and Russian soldiers, and it never ceases to amaze me at just the sacrifice and the bravery that soldiers say. So on behalf of everybody in this call and on behalf of the world, to the speakers tonight, thank you so much.
And I want to thank you, Scott, for leading the program tonight. And thank you, everybody, for coming onto the program to listen to the stories. We are going to be back next Monday night. But before that, we will be back, BBC, for the Vetathon this coming Thursday. Again, check it out on our website, veteransbreakfastclub.org, for the full schedule from midnight to midnight. Pop on anytime. You're welcome anytime to come on. Listen to us. If you have a remembrance that you would like to share of a veteran in your life, you are welcome to chime in at any point during that day. You're welcome anytime. So thank you, Scott. Any final words?
I just want to say thank you as well. I mean, especially to the 4 veterans who joined me tonight. It's been such a pleasure getting to know you guys over the last 10 years. To bring all of you together in this way has been just a real treat for me. And I look forward to being able to do it at the school and to being in person. And thank you to Ariel. Very nice to have students join in, and George and Claire as well. This has been a great night for me.
Thank you.